My best friend Kevin and I were both 22, and we were always on the lookout for something fun to do on the weekends. One night we were bored out of our minds. We had already binge-watched every show on Netflix, and it was too early to hit the bars. Kevin suggested we check out this new retro arcade that had opened up downtown. Sounded like a good idea, right? We thought it would be a fun way to kill a few hours. The arcade was called Game Over, kinda cheesy, but it had good reviews on Google. We got there around 8 p.m. The place was packed with all sorts of old-school games: Pac-Man, Space Invaders, Donkey Kong, and some pinball machines. The walls were covered in neon lights, and the whole place had this nostalgic vibe. It reminded me of the arcades I used to go to as a kid. Kevin and I bought some tokens and started playing. For the first hour or so, we were having a blast. We were getting competitive over who could get the highest score on Galaga, and I was beating him by a mile. Then something weird happened. I was playing a game of Miss Pac-Man when I noticed this guy watching me from across the room. He was just standing there, staring. He looked to be in his late 40s, kinda scruffy, wearing a dirty baseball cap and an old leather jacket. At first I thought he was just waiting for his turn to play, so I didn't think much of it. But then he started to creep me out. He wasn't watching the game, he was watching me, like intensely. I told Kevin about it, and he just laughed it off, saying the guy was probably just high or something. I tried to shake it off and went back to playing. But every time I glanced over, the guy was still there, eyes glued to me. After a while, Kevin and I moved to the back of the arcade where there were some newer games and racing simulators. We were having a good time again, and I almost forgot about the creepy guy. But then I saw him again, out of the corner of my eye. He was standing near the entrance to the restrooms, still watching us. I nudged Kevin and pointed him out. Kevin shrugged and said, "Let's just ignore him, man, he's probably harmless." So we did. We spent another hour or so playing games, and the guy eventually seemed to disappear. I figured he had left or finally lost interest. But when we were about to leave, I went to the bathroom, and that's when things got really weird. The arcade bathrooms were at the end of a narrow hallway. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. It was empty, and there were only 2 stalls and a couple of urinals. I went into one of the stalls and locked the door. While I was in there, I heard the bathroom door open and close. I figured it was just another customer. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps. They stopped right outside my stall. I stayed quiet, thinking maybe the person would just use the urinal and leave. But then I saw the shadow of someone standing there. The person didn't move. They just stood there, silently. I started to get really freaked out. I tried to convince myself it was just Kevin messing with me, but something told me it wasn't. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the footsteps again, this time moving away from the stall. The bathroom door opened and closed, and I was alone again. I finished up and cautiously opened the stall door. The bathroom was empty, just as I had left it. I quickly washed my hands and got the hell out of there. When I got back to the main arcade area, I found Kevin and told him what happened. He laughed and said I was being paranoid, but I could tell he was a little weirded out too. We decided it was time to leave. As we walked out of the arcade, I looked over my shoulder and saw the creepy guy standing outside, smoking a cigarette. He watched us as we walked to Kevin's car. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling myself that he was just a weird dude and that was the end of it. But it wasn't. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I'd see the guy's face in my mind whenever I closed my eyes. I started avoiding going out at night and kept looking over my shoulder whenever I was outside. I didn't tell Kevin because I didn't want him to think I was losing it. Then, one night about a week after the arcade incident, I was home alone. My parents were out of town, and I had the house to myself. I was sitting in the living room watching TV when I heard a noise outside. It sounded like someone walking on the gravel driveway. I got up and looked out the window, but I didn't see anything. I figured it was just my imagination and went back to watching TV. But then I heard the noise again, this time closer. My heart started racing. I grabbed a baseball bat from my room and went to the front door. I slowly opened the door and stepped outside. The night was eerily quiet. I looked around but didn't see anything unusual. I was about to go back inside when I heard a rustling sound coming from the bushes near the side of the house. I gripped the bat tighter and walked towards the bushes. As I got closer, I saw a shadowy figure crouching behind the bushes. My blood ran cold. It was the guy from the arcade. He stood up slowly and stepped into the light. His face was twisted into a sinister grin. "What do you want?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, grinning. I backed away, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. I was about to turn and run back inside when he spoke. His voice was low and menacing. "You shouldn't have come to the arcade. Now you've seen too much." I didn't understand what he meant, but I didn't stick around to find out. I turned and bolted back into the house, slamming the door behind me. I locked all the doors and windows and called the police. By the time they arrived, the guy was gone. They took my statement and promised to keep an eye out, but I could tell they didn't take me seriously. For the next few days, I stayed with Kevin. I was too scared to be alone. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the creepy guy lurking around every corner, but he never showed up again. Eventually, I moved back home, but I never really felt safe again. My friends and I decided to visit the old arcade on the edge of town. We'd heard rumors that it was closing down and wanted to check it out before it disappeared for good. The place had been around since our parents were kids, and we figured it would be fun to take a trip down memory lane. We got there around noon. The sun was blazing and the parking lot was almost empty. The big neon sign that used to light up the whole street was flickering, barely hanging on. It was kind of sad seeing it like that, but we shrugged it off and went inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It was a mix of dust, old carpet, and something else I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was just the smell of time. The place was pretty empty, save for a couple of kids and an old guy behind the counter who looked like he'd been there forever. We wandered around checking out the machines. Most of them were the same as when we were kids, but a lot more beat up. The screens were scratched, the buttons sticky. But it was still kind of cool. We split up to try different games. I ended up at one of the old racing games, the kind where you actually sit in a little car. The screen flickered a bit when I started, but it worked well enough. I got really into it, forgetting about everything else for a while. That's when I heard him. This kid, maybe about 12 or 13, standing next to me. He was skinny with dark hair hanging in his eyes. His clothes looked a bit too big for him, like hand-me-downs. He said, his voice was quiet, almost a whisper, "Hey, you're pretty good at that," I replied, not looking away from the screen. "Thanks. You should try the game in the back, it's really cool. I bet you'd like it." I glanced at him. There was something about the way he said it that made me curious. Plus, I'd never seen a game in the back. I said, getting out of the seat, "Sure, why not?" He led me to a corner of the arcade that was darker than the rest. There was a single machine standing there, one I didn't recognize. It looked old, even older than the others, with a faded screen and a joystick. The title was written in some weird, almost unreadable font. I squinted at it but couldn't make it out. The kid urged, "Go ahead, give it a try." I hesitated for a moment but then shrugged and put a coin in the slot. The screen lit up and a low, rumbling sound filled the air. The game was strange, nothing like I'd ever played before. The graphics were crude, almost primitive, but the gameplay was oddly captivating. It felt like the game was drawing me in, deeper and deeper. The kid watched silently as I played and I lost track of time. It wasn't until I reached the final level that I noticed something was off. The characters on the screen, they looked familiar, too familiar. I paused and stared at them, my heart starting to race. They looked like my friends, the ones I'd come to the arcade with. I muttered, "What the hell?" But the kid just smiled. I tried to quit the game, but the joystick wouldn't move. The buttons didn't work. The screen flashed, and suddenly, everything went black. The arcade was gone, and I was standing in complete darkness. I could hear voices, distant and echoing. They sounded like my friends calling my name, but they were faint, like they were miles away. Panic set in. I felt around, but there was nothing, just emptiness. Then out of nowhere, a spotlight flicked on, blinding me for a second. When my eyes adjusted, I saw the kid standing there grinning.
"Welcome to the game,"
I demanded, my voice shaking. "What's going on? Where am I?"
"This is the final level. You wanted to play, right? Now you have to finish it."
I didn't understand what he meant, but I knew I had to find my friends. I stumbled forward, the darkness closing in around me. The voices grew louder, more urgent. I followed them, my heart pounding in my chest. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, but eventually I saw a faint light up ahead. I ran towards it, hoping it was an exit. But when I got there, I found myself back in the arcade, right in front of that same old machine. My friends were there, looking just as confused and scared as I felt. I asked, my voice trembling, "Guys, what the hell is going on?"
We don't know.
We were playing our games and then everything went dark. Next thing we knew, we were here.
The kid was gone, but his presence still lingered. I turned back to the machine, and that's when I noticed something horrifying. The screen was flashing images of us, like a twisted slideshow. Each picture showed us in different parts of the arcade, but we weren't just playing games, we were different. Our eyes were vacant, our faces twisted in unnatural expressions. It was like we were puppets, controlled by something unseen. I said, my voice barely a whisper, "We need to get out of here." We tried to leave, but the doors were locked. We have to finish the game, I realized. That's the only way out. We gathered around the machine, our hands shaking as we took turns playing. The levels were harder now, the challenges more intense. It felt like the game was alive, reacting to our fear.
Every time we lost, the images on the screen grew more disturbing, more personal.
At one point I saw a picture of myself standing alone in the dark, my face contorted in terror. I wanted to stop, to give up, but I knew we had no choice. We had to keep going. But finally, we reached the last level. The screen flashed and the kid appeared again.
Congratulations, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You've made it to the end.
What now? I asked, barely able to keep my voice steady.
Now you get to leave, but remember, the game never really ends.
With that, the screen went black and the lights in the arcade flickered back on. The doors unlocked and we stumbled out into the daylight, dazed and disoriented. The arcade behind us looked just as it had when we arrived, but I knew it wasn't the same. We never talked about what happened that day. We tried to go back to our normal lives, but the memory lingered, a dark cloud over us. Every time I passed by the arcade, I felt a chill run down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that the game was still out there, waiting for its next players. My name's Jake, and I was 17 at the time. My buddy Sam and I were just hanging out, doing the usual teenage stuff. We were big into arcade games, always trying to beat each other's high scores. There's this old, rundown arcade near our neighborhood, and we'd go there almost every weekend. One Friday evening, we decided to hit up the arcade. The place was dimly lit, the neon signs flickering, and the smell of old pizza lingering in the air. It wasn't the nicest place, but it had character. We walked in, greeted by the familiar sound of beeping machines and the clinking of tokens. As usual, we went straight for our favorite game, Street Fighter, to settle the score from last time. After a few rounds, we decided to take a break and check out some of the other games. That's when we noticed it. Tucked away in a dark corner of the arcade was an old, unmarked machine. It was weird because neither of us had seen it before, and we knew this arcade inside out. The cabinet was plain black, no flashy lights or logos, just a screen and controls. Curiosity got the better of us. Sam walked up to the machine and hit the start button. The screen flickered to life, showing a simple title: The Game. There were no instructions, just a blinking cursor waiting for us to input something. Sam shrugged and pressed start again. The game began with a pixelated version of our neighborhood. It was eerily accurate, down to the smallest detail. The objective seemed simple enough: navigate through the streets, collect items, and avoid obstacles. But as we played, things started getting weird. The game's version of our neighborhood began to change, becoming darker and more twisted. The buildings were dilapidated, the streets cracked and broken. There were no people, just an eerie silence. Then we noticed something even stranger. One of the characters in the game looked exactly like me. Same haircut, same clothes, everything. It was like someone had taken a photo of me and pixelated it into the game. Sam thought it was hilarious, but I felt a knot forming in my stomach. It was just too weird. We kept playing and the game got more disturbing. The character that looked like me started encountering strange messages on the walls. They were cryptic at first, things like, "Watch your back and don't trust them." The further we progressed, the more direct the messages became. "Look behind you," one of them said. It was so specific it made my skin crawl. At that point I was ready to quit, but Sam was determined to see it through. He urged me to keep playing, saying it was just a game and nothing to worry about. So we pressed on. The final level was the creepiest. The screen showed the arcade we were in, but it was all wrong. The lights were out, the machines were broken, and there was this dark figure standing in the middle of the room. It was hard to make out any details, but it seemed to be watching us. The character that looked like me approached the figure and the screen went black. A message appeared. "Look behind you." My heart was pounding in my chest. Sam laughed it off, but I was genuinely scared. I turned around, half expecting to see nothing. But the back door of the arcade, which was usually locked, was slightly open. Beyond it was a dark, narrow alley. Sam and I exchanged uneasy glances. We didn't know whether to investigate or just leave. But well, our curiosity got the better of us again. We walked towards the door, our footsteps echoing in the quiet arcade. The alley was pitch black, and I couldn't see anything beyond a few feet. I called out, my voice trembling, "Hello?" There was no response, just an oppressive silence. Sam took out his phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but old trash cans and graffiti-covered walls. We were about to turn back when we heard a noise. It was faint, like the rustling of leaves. We froze, straining our ears. Then, from the darkness, a figure stepped into the light. It was the same dark figure from the game. My heart felt like it was going to explode. "Who's there?" Sam demanded, trying to sound brave. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, watching us. The light from Sam's phone wasn't enough to see any details, just a vague, shadowy outline. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Let's get out of here," I whispered to Sam. He nodded, and we slowly backed away, keeping our eyes on the figure. Once we were back inside the arcade, we slammed the door shut and bolted it. My mind was racing. Was it some kind of prank, a coincidence? I didn't know what to think. We decided to leave the arcade and head home. The walk back was silent. Neither of us spoke, both lost in our thoughts. The next day, Sam and I went back to the arcade. I needed to know if the game was still there. But when we arrived, the machine was gone. The spot where it had been was empty, like it had never existed. I asked the owner about it, but he just looked at me like I was crazy. He insisted there had never been an unmarked machine in his arcade. Sam and I were dumbfounded. We had both seen it, played it. How could it just vanish without a trace? For weeks I was on edge. Every time I passed by the arcade, I'd glance at the back door, half expecting to see that figure again. I started having nightmares, reliving that night over and over. The figure from the game haunted my dreams, always watching, always waiting.